Hello, I'm Mark Price. I'd like to talk to you today about 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. But first, a story. There was a woman whose husband passed away, and he left her $20,000. And a few months after the funeral, after he died, she was with her girlfriends, and they got talking about things, and she said, "You know, I'm completely broke." And one of the girlfriends said, "Well, I thought your husband left you $20,000. And she said, "Oh, yes, he did." And she said, "But I spent $5,000 on his funeral, and then I spent the $15,000 left. I spent that on his memorial stone." And one of the women said, "Wow, that's a lot of money for a memorial stone. It must be a beauty." And she held up her hand and her finger and showed her ring, and she said, "Yes, it is. 5 carats." That's a woman who knew what she wanted. So the gospel today is Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 to 21. When Jesus heard of the death of John the Baptist, he withdrew in a boat to a deserted place by himself. The crowds heard of this and followed him on foot from their towns. When he disembarked and saw the vast crowd, his heart was moved with pity for them, and he cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples approached him and said, "This is a deserted place, and it is already late. Dismiss the crowd so they can go to the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "There is no need for them to go away. Give them some food yourselves." But they said to him, "5 loaves and 2 fish are all that we have here." Then he said, "Bring them here to me." And he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he said the blessing, broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples, who in turn gave them to the crowds. They all ate and were satisfied, and they picked up the fragments left over, 12 wicker baskets full. Those who ate were about 5,000 men, not counting women and children. The Gospel of the Lord. So in today's reading, it's of course the very well-known reading of the feeding of the multitudes, the feeding in this case the 5,000. This story is told 6 times in the New Testament. It's told in each of the 4 Gospels and 2 other times. Now when stories are told in Scripture many times, it's because the early church, the gospel writers, felt that it was a very, very important story and one that we should all hear. And so when all 4 gospel writers include it, it's because they really want to drive home this message of Jesus feeding the multitudes. So it's an important reading. And I want to, this morning in my reflection, I want to bring out 2 points that came to my mind as I was praying about this morning. And then I will leave time for our good friend Doubting Thomas, who was there at this feeding of the multitudes, to share his firsthand account. But first, my 2 thoughts. They are the goodness of God and the miraculous nature of God. We see both of those things in this story today. We see the goodness of God because when he realized that they were hungry, he said, "Let's feed them." And he didn't say, "Well, let's just feed the people who are on our side. Let's just feed the people who believe in me." He said, "Let's feed them, all of them." And that's what God does. God blesses the world by giving what we need, the blessings that he shares with everybody. Jesus died on that cross for everybody, not just select few. Our only responsibility is to embrace him, enter in relationship with him, and believe in him. But he did it for everybody. This story today is also a parallel to the Old Testament and the Israelites who had been in captivity and slavery by the Egyptians. Oh, wait a minute. Did I say slavery? 5,000 years ago, slavery? 3,000 years ago, slavery? 4,000 years ago, slavery? I thought we're hearing in our news today that slavery was invented by white people in America in 1619. So who's right? The news people that are telling us that, or the Bible, which gives us story after story of people that were enslaved in history? I pick the Bible. I choose to believe the Bible. And by the way, the slaves that we've seen throughout history for 5,000 years are people of all colors, all races, were enslaved, and people of all colors and all races were the masters. So there's no white people in 1619 in America who created this concept of slavery. So in the Old Testament, we hear the story of the Israelites escaping from the slavery of the Egyptians. They're wandering the desert for 40 years, and they're hungry. And what happens? God provides for them, gives them bread in the desert, manna in the desert. He, like Jesus, God did not say, okay, I only want the people who are good followers of the commandments, good followers of me. He didn't say, separate out the ones who are building golden calves or those who are into idolatry. He said, everybody, you're hungry, I'm going to provide bread, manna, food, sustenance for everybody, because that's the nature of God. That's the goodness of God. And the miraculous nature of God, of course, is just being able to create that manna out of that barren desert, or Jesus taking 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish and somehow being able to feed 5,000. And let me say this, that it says in Matthew today, 5,000 men, not counting women and children. So women and children were there, and we know historically there were always many, 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 many more women and children than men. Historians and theologians believe that there were likely 15 to 20,000 people there that day that Jesus fed with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Now, we're seeing the goodness of God. Jesus didn't say to them, okay, separate the believers of me on this side, scribes, Pharisees, and those who don't believe on the other side. He said, you're hungry, all of you are going to be fed. And he took the bread and fish, he blessed it, he broke the bread and shared it. We see a connection there, of course, to our communion, our Eucharist, but we also see the goodness of God because he's offering it to everybody, but we see the miraculous nature of God because he made 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish enough for all that were there. Now, I'm going to suggest something, and I don't want this in any way to take away from the miracle of God. God created this miracle of using 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. But I'm going to suggest that maybe there was a secondary miracle there. And don't get mad at me and say, don't even think that, because this is just a huge miracle of God, and don't bring anything else into it. But I'm going to anyway. So maybe, just maybe, there was a second miracle this day. And the miracle was that the teachings of Jesus that day and the healing of the people changed and softened the hearts and the minds of all those people. And maybe, just maybe, they actually heard Jesus when he said that we're to love God and to love each other. And the only way to love God is to love each other. So how do we love each other? By tending the lambs and tending the sheep and feeding the lambs and feeding the sheep. So maybe, just maybe, their hearts were warmed to such an extent that when those baskets of the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish were being passed through the crowds, that they were looking into their own knapsacks, as poor as they were, and as little as they had, if they found morsels of food, they put it into the basket to share. So maybe, just maybe, part of this great miracle of God was the changing of the minds and the hearts of the people that were there and were listening. So today's reading shows me the goodness of God and the miraculous nature of God. But let's hear from somebody who was actually there, Doubting Thomas, in his own words.
I went to Jesus and I said to him, they have murdered your cousin, and it was at a celebration. I saw a face on Jesus like I cannot explain to you. And he said to me, I must be alone. I said, yes, why don't you go and take one of the boats and go out into the lake and be alone and mourn for your cousin? So Jesus went down to the boat and he started to go out into the lake, but people started to see him because they knew him from his preaching, yes? And from his healing. And so they started to call to him. They said, Jesus, we want to speak with you. We need to speak with you. And Jesus is trying to go out on the lake to mourn. And finally he is in a secluded spot. But many peoples had followed him along the shore and came and they said, Jesus, please, you must listen to us. You must come and talk to us. So Jesus did what Jesus always does. he stops doing what he knows he in his heart needs to reach out and meet the needs of the others. So he brought the boat to shore, he came to shore, and for hours he talked to the peoples, he listened to them, he answered their questions, he healed their sick. And then it was very late. And it was time for the peoples to eat. They were very hungry. And so a few of us went to Jesus and said, you must tell these people to go home now. They must go home, they must eat. And Jesus said to us, why don't we feed them? And we said to Jesus, we can't feed them. We don't have enough food. And if we were to buy the food, the cost of the food would be 700 or 800 days' wages. We don't have the money, we don't have the food. And Jesus asked, he said, well, how much food do we have? So we went, we looked, we came back, we said, Jesus, we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. Jesus said, fine, that's fine. Would you bring it to me? So we brought it to him in a basket. We watched as he blessed it, he broke it. And then he asked us to pass the baskets up and down through the peoples. And do you know we did that? And do you know that when we had finished, we picked up the scraps, and that the scraps filled 12 baskets filled? Did you know that? We started with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes, and when he had finished, there were 12 baskets full from the scraps. That's a miracle, yes? Don't tell me Jesus is not Messiah. Do you know how many people we fed that day? No, am I talking to mutes? You say this, what is this? 5,000. That's what your book says, yes? 5,000. It says something else. Not counting women and children. Let me tell you something. There were always 4 or 5 times as many women and children as there were men. Jesus fed 20,000 that day with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. Jesus is Messiah, yes, chosen and anointed by God.
So there you have it from Thomas himself, who was there. He was a direct witness, an eyewitness to this feeding of the multitudes. Let us in our lives daily look for the goodness of God, and let us look for the miraculous nature of God in all that we see. And maybe, just maybe, as I shared in a reflection the other day, maybe we can do that in part by seeing Christ in the people in our lives and by being Christ. In other words, being there for the people that God puts in our lives. Amen? This is Mark Price. Thanks for listening.